So, what is a variation? But what is a claim? Is it the same thing or are they different? I will explain this using three scenarios for you to really understand it. The first scenario has to do with labor. So let's say labor received a purchase order. A purchase order is for logistics. She needs to transport materials from Limpopo to Cape Town. However, when the purchase order was finalized, labor got an instruction from the client where the client was informing labor to say, we are now moving our drop-off point. Instead of you transporting from Limpopo to Cape Town, we now need you to transport from Limpopo to Richards Bay. Remember, the original scope or the original purchase order was transporting Limpopo to Cape Town. Now there is a change. The change says transport from Limpopo to Richards Bay. But this specific change can either result in more time for labor or more money for labor, or it can just be a negative variation, where a negative variation means labor doesn't get extra money or labor doesn't get extra time, but actually the person who benefits is the client. Remember, in this scenario, if labor was going to transport from Limpopo to Cape Town, the distance between Limpopo and Cape Town now gets reduced because Richards Bay is much closer than Cape Town when you are coming from Limpopo. That's one. But two, the toll gates or the number of toll gates that labor was going to be exposed to from Limpopo to Cape Town, when she now changes the direction to come to Richards Bay, it's actually then less toll gates, right? Then we look at accommodation. Let's say labor was going to spend more on accommodation if she was going to go to Cape Town. But now, because the employer has changed the location to Richards Bay, it actually means labor will spend less days requiring accommodation, right? So yes, it's a change. And yes, it's a variation. However, the employer is the one that is benefiting from this change, right? So the process that labor will need to do is to sit down after getting the instruction from the employer saying, we are now changing the drop-off point. Labor now needs to sit down and say, how is this impacting me? If labor had already pre-booked the accommodation, now it means labor must cancel the accommodation. And then if there are any costs associated with canceling the accommodation, labor can put that in her assessment. If labor had already pre-booked the refueling on the road, maybe she has partnered with one of the fueling companies where she was going to stop and fill up her diesel. Now labor needs to call and say, okay, we are changing route. We are now no longer going to Cape Town. We are coming this side. If I had pre-booked, so labor now needs to sit down and reassess to say, has she already committed to this purchase order? And if she has already committed, this change which is now being brought in, how does it affect her commitments where she now needs to conform to the change? If there is any costs that labor will incur as a result of the change, labor puts together her compensation event pack and submits that quotation or that assessment to the project manager to say, okay, I've received your instruction. I will now no longer be going to Cape Town. I'm now going to Richards Bay. But please note, my cost will change this way. My time will change in this way. So that's the first on a variation, to say a variation does not always mean it will result in more money for the service provider, right? Other variations are actually for the benefit of the employer. For example, if labor's contract was to build 5 houses, but now in the process the employer says, no, don't build 5 houses. I actually now only need 3 houses. That's a change. It's a change to the scope that was already committed to labor, that was already signed, that was already confirmed. The employer is now changing that to say, instead of 5 houses, I now need you to give me 3 houses. So the process that labor needs to do, yes, is to receive the instruction from the employer, but labor then needs to sit down and say, how is this variation affecting me? One, if labor had already bought materials for the other houses that the employer is taking out, then labor needs to put that in to say, okay, Mr. Employer, I take it that we are removing the other 2 houses. I'm now only going to do 3 houses. But take note, I had already committed funds in material for the other for the other 2 houses as well. Here are the receipts for that, right? So labor, once she receives the instruction, she sits down and she does her assessment. How is this affecting my schedule? If labor was going to take a year to do the 5 houses, the employer will now benefit because 3 houses might only take labor 6 months, but it's for labor to do that assessment. Labor now needs to sit down and say, okay, the 5 houses were going to take me a year. We are reducing it to 3. For me to do 3 houses, I'm going to now need 6 months and it's going to cost me so and so. So she will then submit an assessment pack for the variation to say, this is what I will now be doing in this contract, right? We are removing. So a variation is either we are increasing the contract or the scope of work, or we are taking away from the contract and from the scope of work. That's the first part I want us to get. So in those 2 examples, I gave you the examples where the employer was actually taking away works from labor, which the compensation events or the variation events on both your NEC, on both your FIDIC, or in any of the other construction contracts that you might be using, the employer is always entitled to change their minds and then to communicate that change to the service provider. But vice versa, the service provider also then has a responsibility, once they receive the instruction, to sit down, do their assessment and say, okay, the employer has changed their minds on what they had previously communicated and committed to us on the contract. As labor, the service provider, how does this change impact me? You assess that, your time, your material, your labor, and anything else that you had pre-committed that somehow the change affects that. Then you put your assessment to the employer. Then the next process is for the employer to approve what you have put together or to give you their own assessment. Remember, both the FIDIC and the NEC does allow the employer to put together their own assessment. But in both instances, whether we are adding into the scope or we are taking away from the scope, there must be an engagement. There must be a meeting of minds of the parties to say, what are we removing? What are we replacing it with? What is left? There must be a meeting of the minds on what this change is, but what this change means. and what to do to implement this change. So that's the first scenario. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to working with you. If you need me to look at your contract claim or your contract variation, we do offer consultation services. You can come to our offices. We are based in Financial Square here in Witbank, Mpumalanga. If you need us to help you to review your claim or to review your compensation event, if you need us to compile it for you just to increase your chances of success, please do reach out to us at admin.contractsimplified.co.za. We also offer training. So training, it's both physical, but we also do online. For physical training, it has to be 4 people or more. Then we come out to you, and then we offer the training to your team, where we make it specific to your industry, but also specific to your business. Remember to follow us on all our social media platforms. We are on LinkedIn, we are on Facebook and Instagram at Contract Management Simplified. Also remember to follow Scale Up Women in Business. That's our partner that we've partnered with in terms of offering webinars. If you are a small business, if you're a medium business, they do have a number of opportunities in terms of growth in the space. So it's Scale Up at Scale Up Women in Business. They are on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.